Climate law matters. Reducing emissions from aviation. Hello, listener, and welcome back to our podcast, Climate Law Matters, in which we explore the legal developments across different sectors to address the key issue of climate change. I'm Steph David, a barrister at 39 Essex Chambers, specialising in environmental and climate change cases. Today, I'm very lucky to be joined by a number of experts in the decarbonisation of aviation. Ali Warrington, Head of Aviation, Energy and Heat Possible, a climate campaigning organisation. Alex Chapman, Senior Economist at the New Economics Foundation, leading up their programme on air transport and tourism. And last but by no means least, David Kay, Legal Director at Opportunity Green. Today, we're going to focus our discussion on the role that the law can play in mitigating emissions from this particular sector. So welcome to the show, everyone. Let's start with the problem. Why are you particularly concerned about emissions from aviation? Ali goes first.
Thanks so much. So we're really concerned about aviation because it's on course to be the UK's most polluting sector by 2040. So this is a really, really sizable chunk of emissions. It's also a sector that's exceptionally difficult to decarbonise. Technological solutions are at very, very early stages. They're very expensive. They've got quite a lot of technological barriers. So we think they're very unlikely to be delivered by 2050 and certainly not at scale. So it's really worrying that the UK government is essentially deluding themselves that it's possible to expand a really high carbon sector without hugely increasing emissions. And the government's also claiming that this will bring growth benefits, even though the arguments on this really don't stack up. And also the aviation industry is making some quite misleading claims about what can actually be done to reduce its emissions. And then finally, we're concerned about this because it's a very unfair sector. So most people fly rarely, if at all, while the wealthiest few take most of the flights. And that just doesn't make sense for a sector that's going to gobble up an increasingly scarce emissions budget.
Thanks, Ali. That's a really helpful overview. David, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, thanks, Ali, and thanks very much for having me on the podcast, Steph. I certainly agree with Ali's concerns, and in particular about the rapid growth of the aviation sector. I saw just last week the International Air Transport Association's latest projections estimate air travel demand more than doubling by 2050. And I think a key concern is that alongside that huge expansion, the sector's climate pollution remains largely unregulated. For whatever reason, the aviation sector benefits from a certain exceptionalism. There seems to be a real lack of political will to bring effective regulation into place.
Alex, when Ali was talking then, she mentioned the point about airport expansion. And I know that one of the focuses you've looked at and Ali's looked at possible is the question of demand management. What exactly does that mean? Are you concerned with stopping people flying altogether?
We're certainly not talking here about sort of ending all flying. I mean, it's obviously, it's a sort of accusation that's thrown at us by some in the sort of sensationalist media. But, clearly this is about managing the sector, about what we do when it comes to growth and what is a sort of responsible level of air travel. So demand management is a sort of fancy way of talking about how many people fly and why they fly and how you sort of control the number that fly to keep it at a sustainable level. And I think the principal mechanism that's already built into the system is, of course, ticket price, right? So when prices are high, demand is constrained. When prices are low, you see more passengers flying. Now, in every sector, there's multiple factors that impact on that ticket price. Some of them are tax, obviously. VAT is normally part of the mix, but of course, aviation is exempted from VAT. But also other supply chain factors like the price of fuel, which of course, right now is likely to go up as a result of what's going on in the Middle East. Demand management is where you say, okay, well, this is the current prevailing price of aviation and flying, but is that too high or is that too low? Do we need it to be higher to achieve our climate targets? Do we need it to be higher to generate more money for the exchequer? And I think, basically all experts are in agreement that aviation is sort of under-contributing or underpriced at the moment. So when we see very high levels of demand, which we do see right now, over 300 million passenger flights a year, we're talking about demand that is sort of been artificially created. It's created because prices are so low, not because people are sort of particularly desperate to fly. There is no fuel duty, there is no VAT, so people obviously fly more. But we can change that. And if you fairly priced carbon, for example, which we currently don't, then people would be disincentivized from flying because they would be facing the full social cost of their actions, which they do in other sectors quite often, but not in aviation.
Thanks, Alex. Before we kind of delve into the price of flying in a bit more detail and possible legal barriers, just to again pick up the point regarding airport expansion. I mean, often the argument in support of airport expansion is economic growth. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously airport expansion is one way to facilitate a significant increase in demand, an increase that many have argued, as I say, is not sustainable. The government argues that it's sort of an essential part of their economic growth strategy. I think that's very misguided. So there's a few fundamental truths that you have to grapple with, and I feel that the Treasury haven't grappled with in their support for airport expansion. The first is that business demand for air travel is not growing. In fact, it peaked in 2006. In absolute terms, the number of passengers flying for business purposes peaked, 20 years ago now. So when we expand airports in the UK, we're talking about leisure flying. Now, of course, it's the business passengers who bring sort of broader productivity and growth benefits, but they're not the ones occupying the new capacity when you expand an airport. When it comes to leisure passengers, with what we see in the UK is that about 2.5 times as many passengers fly out of the country as fly in. So when you expand, particularly the airports like Luton and Gatwick Airport, their fundamental purpose of those airports is to send Brits out of the country, not to bring people in, by a ratio of these days almost 3-1. So you're talking about getting money from precious household budgets into Spain, not into the UK high street. Now, you do obviously see some inbound tourists coming in, but they're not enough to offset that drain. And actually, I think it's interesting how we see, lots of noise at the moment about pubs struggling, high street struggling, and there's been no household income growth for, 15, 20 years in post-inflation terms, real terms. Well, where's the money gone? Yeah, partly there's not been, rising living standards, but also it's gone overseas. We spend more and more, ever more, hundreds of pounds more than we used to in every household budget on flying out of the country. So I find it very strange to see a government so confidently pinning all of its hopes to airport expansion as a route to growth. Now, there might be some exceptions to the sort of narrative I've just presented, but in general, I just don't see the evidence for that. And I think it's a case basically of many people in the Treasury not having done their homework on the actual impacts and instead maybe focusing on the kind of optics. So we're talking about, yes, there will be growth at the airport, but that growth flows almost immediately out of the country and into the pockets of these equity investment firms.
Just bringing it back to the question of the price of flying and the kind of different mechanisms at play. So you regularly hear discussion of carbon pricing as distinct to taxation on aviation. Can you explain that difference in a bit more detail, please?
Yes, I mean, obviously people will be familiar with the main tax you have on aviation, which is air passenger duty, which is a sort of ticket tax. It's a fixed pound amount that goes on every ticket, and it only really varies based on sort of some limited factors around long haul, short haul flying. That tax doesn't do enough to offset the fact that VAT is not charged on aviation and fuel duty is not charged. The famous stat is that when you fill your car up at the pump, you pay more in fuel duty than British Airways have in their entire history. So what is carbon pricing? Carbon pricing is obviously quite similar to a fuel duty in the sense that you're paying proportionate to your impact, and you'll be paying a lot more for a long haul or inefficient flights, for example, in business class or first class, where you're making use of space on the plane less efficiently. The effective carbon price will be more than if you're sort of filling a Ryanair flight on a short haul trip. So what you get is an incentive from that for aeroplanes to be more efficient and for people to make more sustainable choices. So, there are some sort of forms of carbon tax in existence right now. There's something called the Emissions Trading Scheme, the ETS, which puts a carbon price on flights within European Union destinations, but not outside of the EU. And actually, it's priced very cheaply right now. So at the moment, it's about £40 per tonne for those flights, which means on a typical ticket, that's only going to be a few quid in terms of impact. And then when you go to the non-EU destinations, which are the large majority, you're paying basically no carbon tax at all. So you're getting no signal to the customer saying, look, this flight is going to have an impact and we want you to consider that. There's no price signal to make responsible decisions for them or for the airline. And that's what people say is a big oversight.
Ali, you heard then that Alex mentioned the main tax in aviation is the air passenger duty. I mean, what do you at Possible see as the main problems with that approach to taxation?
Yeah, so I think there's quite a few problems with the current approach. I think overall aviation is really undertaxed. And so as Alex mentioned, the whole aviation industry isn't paying a single penny of tax on its fuel. Obviously, this is particularly unfair when it comes to things like private jets. Like, why should ordinary people driving to work pay more tax on that fuel than somebody on a private jet? And the VAT issue is also it's such an anomaly, because usually things that are zero rated for VAT are things like wheelchairs and baby clothes. So the absolute essentials, not, somebody flying on their 6 overseas holidays of the year. But even air passenger duty, as Alex says, it's not really placing any kind of effective incentive on people to make lower carbon choices. So it doesn't really properly tax the sort of luxury end of flights. And we worked out the sort of effective rate of tax on different flights compared to the cost of the flights. And we found that private jet users are paying a real rate of tax of less than 1%. And if you compare that to the sort of effective rate of tax paid by people on standard flights in economy class, that's around 50%. So that's really clearly unfair. But I think what we really need to avoid is a tax system which makes it harder for ordinary people who already don't fly very often to fly at all, while allowing the kind of wealthiest people who already fly the most just to keep on flying. So we want to make sure that we don't have a tax system that doesn't prioritise a kind of fairness of distribution. Although obviously that's not the situation we have at the moment, where all flights are horrendously sort of undertaxed, but that's most extreme at the most wasteful end of the aviation spectrum.
David, just to bring you in on the discussion, one of the reasons is often given for why aviation isn't more highly taxed is the Chicago Convention. Is it right that convention provides a barrier to taxing the sector?
It's a really interesting question. The straightforward answer is no. So as you say, it's the 1944 Convention on International Civil Aviation, known as the Chicago Convention, is often pointed to as the reason why aviation fuel taxes can't be imposed, including in responses to ministerial questions here in the UK. However, when you look closely at the relevant provisions, it's clear that it doesn't place any such restrictions on fuel taxation. So taking them briefly in turn, Article 24 simply says that fuel that's already on board an aircraft when it arrives in a state, and then subsequently kept on board when the same aircraft leaves, can't be taxed. So that's about avoiding customs duties on fuel that's already in the tank. It doesn't say anything about fuel that's uplifted in the state before departure. So states are therefore free to tax that uplifted fuel in accordance with Article 24. Article 15 is also sometimes cited, and that prohibits discriminatory charges for using airports or for the right of transit, entry or exit. And again, that has no bearing on fuel taxes. Fuel is not a charge for airport use or for access to a state's territory. In fact, the court here has already considered Article 15 in the context of the UK's air passenger duty and found that it's an anti-discrimination clause and not a restriction on taxation. So the legal position is actually quite straightforward. The Chicago Convention does not prevent states from taxing aviation fuel, despite the widespread misconceptions.
Are there any other restrictions under international law in relation to aviation taxation?
So where fuel taxation can be restricted is in air services agreements. And air services agreements are the bilateral or multilateral treaties that set the terms for flights between states. And some of these agreements include provisions on fuel taxation, so you do need to look at each one individually. And I think the UK is party to over 200 of these. But what's important, though, is that many of these agreements actually do allow taxation. So, for example, since Brexit, the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement explicitly permits fuel on flights between the UK and the EU to be taxed. So the UK could introduce such a tax tomorrow if it wanted to. And people also often point to ICAO's policy. So ICAO is the International Civil Aviation Organization. And that policy says that fuel for international flights should be exempt on a reciprocal basis between states. But A, that policy isn't legally binding on states. And B, even where similar wording is reflected in air services agreements, it doesn't create an absolute ban. So we at Opportunity Green sought a legal opinion from Estelle de Honquesi and Dr. Lois Lane, and that made clear that reciprocity simply means that if one state introduces a tax, the other state can do the same. So it doesn't actually stop a state from taxing fuel in the first place, which they could do in accordance with the air services agreement with that reciprocity clause in it. So when you put all of that together, the ability for the UK to introduce an aviation fuel tax is in actual fact far more feasible than many people assume.
Thanks, David. That's hugely helpful. So we've kind of gone through what's wrong with the current system and the fact there aren't any obvious legal barriers to reforming it. Alex, I know that you've done a fair amount of work on what modernising transport tax would look like, in particular looking at the issue of frequent flyer levy. Can you just explain that in a bit more detail and any kind of potential legal barriers to that particular proposal?
Yeah, so I think the real issue that we've got is that the government successive governments have done a poor job of articulating how the green transition is in the interests of the sort of, everyday family or whatever, ordinary person here in the UK. And we, I think, are at risk of losing public buy-in to the transition as a result of that. So we need to be thinking incredibly intentionally about designing policies when we do things that might constrain people in some way or affect prices in some way, that they are overtly fair. People look and feel, yes, I understand that change is needed. Broadly, the population get the urgency of the climate crisis, and the government is working hard to make sure it really is done fairly. And that's why we think the frequent flyer levy is such a sort of strong, both policy in itself, but also communication tool, because we estimate that when you expand an airport these days, something like 50% of the new seats you create are being used by people who fly 6 or more times a year. So that's the kind of tiny minority, less than 3% of the population, who are consuming vast amounts of the remaining carbon budget. Now, the policy, a lot of people support it in the polling. Politicians often will sort of generally give warm words in the direction of it because it's quite hard to argue with, really. But then they'll say, but its implementation's impossible. It can actually happen in practice. Nice idea. So we wanted to really dig into that claim. We did a study on a frequent flyer levy at the European level last year. And I think there's a few considerations. So the first is that, the legal opinion that we got, I think I'm paraphrasing them, but I think it was basically, can it be done? Yes. Are there challenges? Yes, there are some challenges to work through. And how big those challenges are depends on the approach that you take. So at the easy end of the spectrum, how can you do a frequent flyer levy? Well, the very easiest way is basically, rather than sort of increasing the tax every single time someone flies, you could, for example, just give someone a discount on their first flight, offer that consistently, and it's basically easy. There's already sort of established ways of doing that, of getting discounts to people. We already have rail cards in use in the UK, similar concept, you could use for that. The sort of second easiest way that the legal advice was sort of suggesting to us would be most viable is that you wouldn't tax at the point of purchasing your ticket, but you could do the tax on the tax return at the end of the year. And you could just require people to declare if they've flown more than 6 times this year. And if they did, they pay a charge for each additional one that they did. We like that approach because it's very specifically targeted to high-income individuals flying very frequently. A lot of people already complete a tax return in the UK, and they would just need to do an extra box. For those who don't, but were flying frequently, you could sort of see the burden of having to complete it as a bit of part of your package to encourage people not to fly excessively. And the suggestion was that the kind of legal implications of doing it that way were relatively sort of easy to work with. The fully worked up system, where you sort of do need to record each time someone flies and then, give them a rising charge based on that, which is the sort of best design of the scheme from a theoretical point of view. The first thing that you need to work around is GDPR. So you need to make sure that you've got the kind of robust structures in place to have an effective tax that doesn't breach people's personal data protections. There is legal powers to do that because there are exemptions from GDPR for sorts of where there's a clear environmental imperative and obviously where responsible practice is in place, but you would just need to make sure you had a mandate from policy to do that. And of course, you would need to set up some sort of flyer identifier number. And the interesting thing is that is actually commonplace in many countries around the world. So in the US, I think the majority of flyers already have a unique flyer number. And not like a reward scheme, but just a sort of government-operated system. Now, that's done for sort of speeding up your transit through security, so it's for security reasons. And it's currently the case that you can basically track people's flights as much as you want if you use the security rationale. So I think you'd need to, again, set up a system that works for people, and you'd need to sort of justify it on the basis of, a sort of strong, I would call it climate security basis as to why we were doing this. And of course, it works better, I think, for more easily in a place like the UK where you're an island state and you don't get into the issue of what happens when someone goes and flies from the neighbouring country and things like that. If you're in the EU and you're trying to implement a frequent flyer levy, it's probably easiest if the EU does it as a block so that you don't get market distortions and things. So basically, there's kind of a sliding scale there. We think it can be done, but obviously there's various considerations along the way and in your scheme design and the ultimate legal ramifications that would have.
Shifting then to the kind of exact nature of aviation, which is quite a unique sector in many ways. So there's the domestic aviation, internal flights, which is quite simple in many ways because it's attributable to UK emissions. But when thinking about international aviation, David, how does the UK legal framework currently address that type of aviation?
Thanks, Steph. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and you've hit upon a key legal problem here. So in the UK, the main framework for addressing climate impacts is, of course, the Climate Change Act. And under that act, emissions from international aviation generally don't count as UK territorial emissions, with the consequence that the first 5 carbon budgets simply left them out. The 6th carbon budget, which will cover the period from 2033 to 2037, finally does bring them in. But crucially, international aviation is still excluded from the UK's nationally determined contribution, its NDC, under the Paris Agreement. And that omission reflects widespread international practice in relation to NDCs. The result of that is a huge volume of emissions falling through that international airspace gap. And it's also out of step legally with the Paris Agreement, which applies to all economic sectors and doesn't provide a carve-out for international aviation.
And how do you think that could be addressed in terms of other international legal levers?
Yeah, so as I just said, a close reading of the Paris Agreement shows that NDCs are required to include international emissions. And that's a pretty crucial starting point because it brings those international emissions into the scope of domestic regulation. And the respective advisory opinions from the International Court of Justice and the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea on climate change both reinforce this. And in the recent case of Greenpeace Netherlands and the Netherlands Bonaire, the Dutch court highlighted the mismatch between the UN climate regime, which requires measures covering all economic sectors, and in that case, the Dutch and European targets, which still exclude or only partially include international aviation and shipping emissions. To the second part of your question, I think one of the most effective tools states already have is one that Alex has mentioned, which is carbon pricing. So back in 2008, the EU amended its emissions trading system, or ETS, to cover emissions from international flights from 2012. Huge political pushback meant those flights were temporarily exempted, and that temporary exemption has now been repeatedly extended. However, the EU Commission is mandated to review that position later this year with the potential for coverage to be expanded to include all departing international flights. So that could help close the regulatory gap that we're currently seeing. And our analysis at Opportunity Green estimates that that temporary exemption alone has left 1.1 billion tonnes of CO2 unregulated. And it's also left 26 billion euros of revenue on the table. So it's a really important opportunity. And while I think we can expect more political pushback, the legal position actually is very clear, because when that legislation was initially brought in, various American airlines challenged the original legislation in the English courts, and questions of EU law were referred to the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice confirmed that the EU has the competence to regulate emissions from international flights that arrive in or depart from the EU. They're subject to the EU's unlimited jurisdiction. So there's a clear legal basis and a major opportunity there to finally bring these emissions within an effective regulatory framework.
Just one final point to pick up on before we conclude today's episode is in relation to non-CO2 emissions. Ali, can you very briefly explain what they are?
So around 2/3 of the warming impacts of flight actually comes from the emission of gases other than carbon dioxide, so things like nitrogen oxides and water vapour. And the science on this is actually really clear. There's not a huge amount of uncertainty. We know what these gases are and we know what the warming impacts of them is. And what that means is that the sort of actual warming impact of flights is 3 times the effects of the carbon dioxide emissions alone. So that means there's actually quite a lot less room in emissions budgets than if you just look at the carbon dioxide emissions. And what's really worrying about this is that there's a tendency for both the government and the aviation industry to try and say that actually there isn't this scientific certainty which actually exists, to say that we don't know what these impacts are, let's ignore them, let's do more research, let's not take them into account at this point. And actually that is really misleading, because we do know what the impacts of non-CO2 emissions are. But even if we didn't have that clarity, a basic understanding of the precautionary principle would suggest that means there needs to be more caution in terms of allowing this industry to keep emitting rather than less caution. And I think as well there's a tendency from both the government and the aviation industry to say that technological solutions will fix this, so things like alternative fuels will tackle the non-CO2 impact. And again, that's just really misleading, because these fuels might have lower non-CO2 emissions, but given all the other problems with these fuels, the limited supply of them, all the other resource and environmental problems that they might cause if people try to scale them up. So they're really not a solution either. And of course, this also has an impact on the viability of things like carbon removals. They already have a lot of problems. They're going to be very expensive, very resource intensive. But even if you could have this theoretical scenario in which you're basically removing all of the carbon dioxide that airplanes are emitting, you're still not tackling that other 2/3 of warming. So it just makes the whole problem more difficult, and it suggests even more of a need for demand reduction to really tackle the environmental impacts.
I mean, you raised that point about scientific uncertainty and how that's relied upon by government and industry. And certainly you see that playing out in various aviation judicial review challenges, where essentially what's been said is, you say, scientific uncertainty which justifies a policy approach of essentially undertaking more research. We've seen that back in the Supreme Court in Heathrow in 2020 and up to the most recent case in Jet Zero strategy, Ali, your case before Christmas. Is there anything you want to say on that in relation to how the courts approach the question of scientific uncertainty and kind of defer to decision makers on that point?
I think it was really unfortunate that the court was really not willing to sort of actually look into the science on this or engage with what was actually a really key question coming out of the legal case, which is, was the government's position reasonable? Was it evidence-based? Was it supported by the science? So I think that anyone looking into it would end up seeing that the government's position on things like non-CO2 impacts just doesn't stack up. And it's leaving a huge chunk of warming that isn't being effectively mitigated. And it's quite difficult because the court is both sort of unwilling to look into this and also unwilling to really challenge ministers and to challenge government policy. And that leaves the UK's climate plans and our emissions budget. It's potentially extremely vulnerable if ministers are free to make decisions and set policies in a way that doesn't take into account the evidence and actually really flies in the face of the evidence, because then you end up with unworkable emission strategies for incredibly high carbon sectors like aviation.
And Ali, it raises a really important question about the role of the courts in judicial review, because ultimately, they don't want to enter the political arena. That's not the role of the courts. It's very much upholding what the legislation says, ensuring decisions taken rationally and fairly. So it brings me really to my last question, which is going to each of you in turn. What do you see as the greatest legal barrier or opportunity in addressing climate change? I start with you, Alex.
I think that the point about the precautionary principle is really important. We've just heard about that, and we've got the environmental principles policy statement that in theory, makes that a matter of law, but we're waiting to see if that actually has any teeth. And we'll find out soon in the airport's national policy statement whether they really respect the meaning and sentiment of that piece of legislation. The other sort of open legal question, I think, is related to sort of competition between sectors for remaining carbon budget. So for me, it feels very little discussion of the fact that when aviation overspends its share of the carbon budget, someone else has to underspend. And it feels like maybe we're going to realise too late that that actually comes with a significant cost, for example, to the UK steel industry or power industries or other parts of manufacturing, who will see the cost of their carbon or their decarbonisation increase as a result of the decisions aviation has made. And as it stands, there isn't an adequate legal framework to ensure that those decisions are made transparently and fairly in the public interest. Is it in the wider interest for ultra-frequent flyers to be gobbling up all of the carbon budget? when industries like food, for example, might, be getting squeezed, might be having a difficult time, which are really fundamental to our sort of basic survival. And I think there hasn't really been enough awareness amongst, including the business and the public sector and, politicians and civil servants and the like, that we are in a world of, zero-sum game. If someone gains, someone else is losing. And we haven't articulated whose responsibility each different component is, especially when we start coming to the tricky issue about carbon capture and how we're going to start drawing down emissions, whose responsibility that is.
I'm going to cheat slightly here if I'm allowed to, because I would say the greatest legal barriers to addressing aviation's climate impact are actually perceived ones rather than real ones. And I think we've discussed today a few cases of that where states do have relative freedom to regulate, and it's the political will to address aviation's pollution that's the barrier rather than legal impediments. I think for the legal opportunity, looking outside of the UK, I would say that European Court of Justice ruling that I mentioned on the EU's competence to include international flights in the emissions trading system. That was 15 years ago now, but it would be a huge missed opportunity if the EU doesn't use those legal powers to regulate flights later this year.
Yes, that makes sense. One to watch. Ali, finally to you, what do you think?
Yeah, so I agree with David that actually the issue is less that there are legal barriers in place and more that the political will isn't there. And it is just incredibly disappointing that the current government, which is supposed to be leading the way on climate, is just rushing backwards when it comes to aviation. And it's definitely the case that for every ton of emissions that someone on a private jet produces, other people with lower emissions, less money, less wealth, less resources are going to have to either pick up the slack to that, or we're not fitting in with emissions targets. And in terms of the role of the legal system, obviously there's some really great work being done, but it is also just really worrying that UK courts are so reluctant or unwilling to rule against ministerial decisions. And even when those decisions are really, really flawed and they're based on a refusal to properly assess risk or evidence. So the lack of kind of real teeth in the legal system in terms of making sure that emissions are on track and sort of actually on track, not just the ministers say they will suddenly become on track one day. I think that's a real risk.
On that point, Ali, it just shows how important the consultation process is. So organisations like Possible, like the New Economics Foundation, like Opportunity Green, can raise these issues so that they're at the forefront of decision makers' minds. But thank you very much for your time, everyone. Sorry we've come to the end of the episode, but it's great to hear all your views on how aviation could be decarbonised and, the fact there aren't actually the legal barriers that some people might think.